The fog came off the river that morning thick as milk, and it was the sound that reached her first. Not the wheels, which were muffled by mud, but the horses, 4 of them, breathing hard in the cold, their harness bright with a jingling that had no business on that narrow street. She had been at the bench since before light, fingers black with iron gall ink, a torn spine open before her like a wound she meant to close. The workshop smelled of hide glue and beeswax, and the tallow candle guttering by her elbow, and she did not look up until the shadow of the carriage fell across the window glass, blotting the gray dawn entirely. It was lacquered black, trimmed in a green so dark it read as black too, until the light caught it, and on the door, a crest she did not recognize but understood at once, the kind of crest that meant a man had never had to knock on a door in his life, because doors opened themselves. She set down her folder. She did not wipe her hands, because there was no time, and because some stubborn part of her thought, "Let them see what I am." The footman who descended wore livery so clean it seemed an insult to the mud he stood in. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Miss Marrow, the Duke of Ashcombe, requires your attendance at once." Across the street, half hidden in the doorway of his own shuttered shop, her uncle stood with a bolt of gray wool still under his arm, delivered not an hour before, and forgotten entirely now. 3 nights passed, at his own table, over a joint gone cold because he liked to talk before he liked to eat. He had said the thing he always said, the thing that had become almost a kindness through repetition, that she mended spines because no man would ever want to mend his life with her, that no duke, no gentleman of any consequence, would look twice at a bookbinder's daughter with ink under her nails, and no dowry to speak of. He had laughed when he said it. His wife had laughed with him. Eliza had only nodded, because there was nothing in the sentence worth arguing with, and because arguing had never once changed what was true. Now he stood in the doorway with his mouth slightly open, the bolt of wool slipping unnoticed against his coat, and said nothing at all, which was, for a man who filled every silence he had ever encountered, its own kind of confession. The footman held the carriage door. Behind him the horses shifted, impatient with the cold, their breath rising like the fog was rising, everything pale and unfinished in that hour before the town was properly awake. Eliza looked down once at her hands, at the ink she had not thought to hide, and then she looked past the footman to her uncle's face, not in triumph, for there was no triumph yet in anything, only the strange unbalancing feeling of a door opening, where she had been told, for 3 days, and for most of her life, that no door ever would. She untied her apron. And the folding of it in her hands was the last steady thing she did before the morning pulled her backward, the way a thread pulls when you have not finished the knot. 3 days before, the room had smelled of mutton fat and tallow smoke, and the table had been too small for the number of relatives crowded round it, elbows nearly touching, the good cloth brought out though no occasion warranted it except the occasion he always made of himself. Her uncle had carved with more ceremony than the meat deserved. He liked an audience for his carving, as he liked an audience for everything. A bookbinder's daughter, he had said, not to her, but about her, the way one might discuss a horse with a poor gait in front of the horse itself, with glue on her fingers, instead of a ring on them. He had laughed at his own arrangement of the words, before anyone else could laugh with him, which was his habit, and his wife had obliged a half-beat behind, and the cousins had smiled into their plates, because it was easier than not smiling. Eliza had kept her eyes on the potatoes, which were underdone, and said nothing, because there was nothing to correct in a sentence built entirely of things that were true. She did mend spines instead of hunting for a husband. She did have no dowry. Her father had left her a workbench, a paring knife worn thin as a rumor, and debts he had been too proud to mention, until they were already owed. It was the wine, perhaps, or simply the pleasure of an easy target, that had carried her uncle further than the first remark. He had leaned back, waistcoat straining, and delivered the line as though it were a toast. No duke will ever look twice at a bookbinder. And this time the whole table had laughed properly, freely, the way people laugh when they believe they are laughing at something that will never be tested. She had thought, at the time, that it was not even cruelty exactly, it was arithmetic. He had simply added up what she was, an orphan tradesman's daughter in a town where the fog rarely lifted before 10, and what a duke was, and found the sum so obviously nothing that he had not troubled to lower his voice. She had gone home that night through streets slick with the same fog that would, 3 mornings later, be rising pale off the backs of 2 carriage horses outside her own door, and she had told herself, as she banked the fire and set her father's paring knife back in its cloth, that a woman who mended other people's ruined pages for a living could not afford the luxury of minding what was said over mutton. She had believed that, mostly. She was still believing it, or trying to, when she stepped past her uncle's silence and into the cold. The workshop that had been her father's occupied the narrow ground floor of a house on Candle Street, and it smelled, at every hour of every season, of the same 2 things: leather and glue, the first sharp and animal, the second sweetish and warm, boiling low on the back of the stove where it would not scorch. She had grown up believing this was simply what air smelled like. It was only later, visiting other households, that she understood most people lived without it, and pitied them faintly for it, the way one pities a person who has never learned to swim. Her father's tools still hung where he had hung them, 11 years gone now, and the leather strop worn pale in the middle, from his hand and then from hers. The bone folder, the awl with its handle wrapped in waxed thread, because the original horn had cracked one December, and there had been no money that winter for a new one. She used them daily, not out of sentiment. She would not have permitted herself that indulgence, not with the accounts as they stood, but because they were simply the best tools she owned, and a woman with 3 shillings between herself and the quarter's rent did not replace what still answered to her hand. The money was, in truth, the shape of her whole life, the way a riverbed is the shape of a river. She took in what work came: a solicitor's torn deed box, a vicar's crumbling hymnal, once a merchant's ledger, so waterlogged she had spread its pages across every flat surface in the house for 4 days running, weighting each with smooth stones from the mill pond, while her landlady's boy tracked mud through, and asked, was she a witch? She charged fairly and was paid slowly, when she was paid at all, and she had learned not to flinch at either. What she had not replaced, what she had simply set down as one sets down a parcel too heavy to carry further, was the other future, the one her uncle liked to gesture toward at dinners, the modest tradesman's match, the security of a husband's name over her own on the workshop door. She did not mourn it precisely. She had watched enough marriages in Thornfield Market to know that a ring was no guarantee against cold rooms or colder husbands, and she had her father's example instead, a man who had loved his work honestly, kept his word to the shilling, and left his daughter nothing but tools and a debt she had spent 6 years paying down to nothing. It was, she told herself, a fair trade. Dignity did not keep a fire lit, but neither, she had noticed, did most marriages. She was still telling herself this, sleeves pushed back, hands already smelling of glue though it was not yet 7, when she heard, through the fog outside her window, the particular sound a good horse makes on old cobbles, unhurried, expensive, entirely wrong for Candle Street. She did not go to the window at once. She finished pressing the glue brush flat against its saucer, wiped her fingers on the rag that hung permanently from her belt, and only then crossed the room, because she had learned that certain sounds outside a workshop window were best not met with visible eagerness. Eagerness, her father used to say, is the tradesman's tax on his own dignity. Pay it, and you have already lost the sale. The horse was gray, or had been gray once, its coat dulled by the fog into something like pewter. The harness caught what little light there was and gave it back sharpened. No cart followed it, no crates of leather or paper waiting to be unloaded, only a single closed carriage, black lacquered, entirely unfamiliar to a street that knew every wheel that had ever turned down it. She let the curtain fall back into place and told herself it was for someone else. Candle Street held 4 other tradesmen between her door and the corner, a chandler, a wheelwright, a woman who mended lace with a patience Eliza privately envied. A carriage like that might have business with any of them, or none, might simply have taken a wrong turn from the coaching road and be waiting now for its driver to admit the error. And yet, she thought, unbidden, of the courier. He had come 4 days past, on foot, in a coat too fine for walking and boots too clean for the season, and he had asked his questions not of her directly but of the chandler's boy, and then of the woman who kept the corner stall, phrasing it each time as though it cost him nothing to ask, and mattered less what answer he received. Who binds books hereabouts? Whose hand is trusted with the old work, the delicate work, the sort no ordinary tradesman would touch? The boy had named her without hesitation. There was no one else to name, and the courier had nodded, thanked him with a coin, that was itself a small extravagance for so plain a question, and gone. She had heard of it that same evening, second-hand, over her uncle's table, and had thought little of it. County houses were forever losing track of their libraries, and remembering them again in a panic, usually after some aunt's estate needed dividing, or some lawyer required an inventory. It was the sort of inquiry that came twice a year and led nowhere twice a year. She had not connected it, until this moment, to anything resembling a carriage. Outside, the horse shifted its weight, and harness brass sang once against the cold. A door, not her own, opened somewhere down the street, then closed again, apparently unsatisfied. Footsteps approached, unhurried, deliberate, the tread of a man in no danger of being kept waiting by anyone. Eliza set down her rag, smoothed her apron with both hands, as though that alone might explain her presence in it, and stood very still, listening, while the fog outside pressed close against the glass, and the footsteps came nearer to her door than to any other on the street. The footsteps stopped precisely at the threshold, and for a moment nothing happened at all, only the fog moving where the man had disturbed it, and the small brass bell above the door refusing, out of some old stubbornness, to ring on the first attempt. He knocked instead, twice, not the timid rap of a neighbor wanting change for a shilling, but a sound with weight behind it, as though the knuckles belonged to someone accustomed to doors opening before he had finished the gesture. She opened it herself. There was no one else to send. He was not young, and not old. A man perhaps 45, dressed with the particular plainness that only comes from great expense, his coat unornamented, but cut so precisely that it seemed less sewn than grown onto him. He did not step in out of the wet until she had, wordlessly, stepped back to permit it, and even then he paused on the mat to scrape his boots with a thoroughness that suggested habit rather than manners. "Miss Marrow," he said. It was not a question. She said that she was. "I come on behalf of His Grace the Duke of Ashcombe." He produced no card, seemed to feel none was owed to a bookbinder's shop, and continued in the same level voice, as though reciting a report he had given more than once already that morning to less important doors. There was a storm at the hall a month past. The library roof failed above the east gallery. Some 3 centuries of family record are affected. Ledgers, correspondence, estate papers, a number of bound volumes of considerable age. Damaged how badly? Water through the plaster, into the shelving, standing for the better part of 2 days before it was discovered. He said this without apology, as though the delay were a fact of weather rather than of neglect. The trustees have set a date. 1 month from now, whatever remains unsalvaged is to go to auction as it stands, unread, unsorted, unrepaired. They consider it more economical than restoration, and the Duke does not. Something crossed his face then, brief and unreadable, gone before she could name it. His Grace has not said what he considers. He has said only that the work requires a binder capable of judging what may be saved and what may not, and that he was given your name. By whom? By inquiry, he said, which was no answer at all, and she understood she would get no better one standing in her own doorway with her hands still smelling of paste and vinegar. He glanced once past her shoulder, at the shelves of mended spines waiting to be collected, at the modesty of the room, and something in his expression settled, as though he had confirmed a private doubt and found it, contrary to expectation, answered in her favor. "The carriage will return for you within the hour, should you consent," he said. "His Grace does not care to be kept waiting past it." She consented, of course. There had never truly been a question of it, only the shape of her pride, requiring that the question be asked first. The carriage smelled of leather and old rain, and she sat with her hands folded over the small case of tools she had brought, awl, bone folder, a twist of waxed thread, as the fog-bound lanes of the town gave way to hedgerows, and the hedgerows to the long gravel sweep of an avenue she had only ever seen from a distance, on market days, when the ironwork gates stood shut. They did not stand shut now. They stood open, and beyond them, Ashcombe Hall rose gray and vast against a sky the color of dishwater, its west wing dark-streaked below the roofline, where the water had come through, 3 of its windows boarded in raw, unpainted wood that did not match the rest. A house, she thought, that had been beautiful once, and had not yet decided whether to be beautiful again. She was received, not by the Duke, but by silence, a long antechamber, a fire too small for the room, a housekeeper who looked at her boots before her face, and then, after perhaps 20 minutes, by the Duke himself, who entered without ceremony and did not sit. He was younger than she had pictured him, and grayer in manner than in years, as though grief had aged him sideways rather than forward. He held a single damaged folio in his hands, its boards swollen and split, and he set it on the table between them, the way a man sets down evidence. "Tell me what is wrong with it," he said. No greeting, no inquiry after her journey. She turned the folio without touching the text block, feeling first at the spine, then the joints, then the grain of the leather where it had lifted from the board like skin from a burn. The boards have delaminated from damp. The sewing beneath is likely sound. The thread is linen, and linen shrinks before it rots. What has failed is the paste, not the page. And if you are wrong, then your grace will have lost nothing. He had not already resigned to auction. He looked at her then, not the polite half-glance of a man addressing a tradeswoman, but a full, assessing look, the kind she imagined he gave ledgers, or horses, or men he was deciding whether to trust with a debt. "My steward tells me bookbinders are sentimental about paper, that they save what should be let go. Your steward has evidently never watched one lose a week's work to false economy." Something flickered near his mouth, not quite a smile, gone before it could be called one. "You have 1 month," he said. "The trustees will not extend it for sentiment, mine or yours." "I did not ask for sentiment," she said. "Only for light, and a dry room, and to be left to it." He studied her a moment longer, as if the answer had cost him something to hear, and then turned toward the door. "You shall have all 3, he said, "and we will see which of us regrets it." He did not look back again, and the door closed behind him with the particular soft finality of a man accustomed to doors closing exactly when he wished them to. The sound of his boots receded down the corridor, then vanished altogether, and she was alone with the wreckage. The smell reached her first, always the smell, before the eye had finished adjusting to the gloom. Mildew, sweetish and close, laid over the sharper note of ink gone to rust in standing water, and beneath both of these, the smell of old paper itself, which she had loved since childhood, and which no amount of ruin could entirely mask. She set down her satchel on the one dry corner of the reading table, and began, as her father had taught her, not with the worst of it, but with the edges. The vellum nearest the broken window had fared poorest. It had drunk the storm greedily and swollen into something closer to leather than paper, the boards behind it warped into shallow bowls that would never again lie flat against a shelf. She lifted each volume with both hands, the way one lifts something that might crumble or might merely pretend to, and turned it slowly under what light came through the cracked casement. Some she set to her right, on a folded blanket she had brought for the purpose. These were the merely swollen, the merely stained, patient cases, cases that wanted only time and clean linen, and the discipline not to rush them. Others she set to her left, on bare stone, because she did not yet trust herself to promise them anything. She worked in silence for the better part of an hour, and the silence itself became a kind of instrument. She could hear, in it, which pages had stuck fast to their neighbors, and which had merely leaned against them in sympathy. A ledger from some early decade of the last century came apart in her hands along a seam that should have held, and she paused over it longer than the others, turning it toward the gray window light, running one gloved finger along the spine where the stitching had pulled free of the false cover. false cover. She noted the phrase to herself, and did not yet know why she had thought it, only that the leather here was a shade darker than its fellows, and glued rather than sewn, in a manner none of the other volumes shared. She said it, for now, with the patient cases, though something in her did not quite believe it belonged there. Outside, the fog had not yet lifted from the drive, and she could hear, faintly, the stamp and shift of the carriage horses being led back toward the stables, and beneath that, further off, the ordinary sounds of a great house continuing its ordinary morning, a bell, a door, a voice raised briefly and then lowered. None of it reached her here. She had, as she had asked, light, and a dry corner, and the whole ruined month before her, and for the first time since she had stepped down from the carriage, she allowed herself to feel something other than watchfulness. She turned back to the ledger with the false cover, and began, very carefully, to work it open. The knife she used for lifting old glue was thin as a fishbone, and she worked it beneath the false cover's edge with a patience that would have looked, to an untrained eye, like idleness. It was not idleness. It was the only way such work could be done without tearing what lay beneath. And she had learned this at her father's bench, before she had learned her letters properly. Learned it in her hands, before she had ever thought to put it into words. The butler found her so, an hour later, when he came to ask whether she required more coal for the small grate that had been lit against the damp. She did not look up. She said she required nothing, thank him, and went on working, and he stood a moment longer than the question strictly warranted, watching the slow, exact movement of her wrist, before he withdrew. He reported to the Duke that evening, in the manner of a man reporting weather rather than character, a fact offered without ornament, to be made of what the listener wished. She had not risen from the bench, he said, save once, near noon, to eat the bread and cheese sent up, and had returned to it within the quarter hour. She had asked for nothing beyond light and coal. She had catalogued 11 volumes by his own count, though he could not speak to the quality of the work, only its steadiness. The Duke, seated at his desk with correspondence he was not reading, said only that steadiness was cheaply had in servants and dearly missed in trustees, and turned a page he had already turned twice. But he did not, in the days that followed, entirely put the report from him. It returned to him at odd hours, over his solicitor's letters, over the trustee's notice of the auction's advancing date, the image of a woman, bent over ruined leather for the whole of a working day, asking for nothing. He told himself, when he noticed himself thinking of it, that he was merely a man overseeing an expense, and that any master of a household must know how his money was spent. It was on this pretext, then, that he came down to the library on the third morning, telling the butler he wished only to see how the work progressed, as though the matter required his presence rather than a note. She heard the door and did not startle, though she had not heard him announced. She set down the volume she held, not the false-covered one, which she had returned, for now, to its case, unopened past the first careful inch, and rose, and inclined her head with the same composure she had shown him in the hall 3 mornings before, as if nothing at all had altered in the interval, though a great deal, in fact, had. He asked, in a voice pitched for a man merely checking an account, how the work went on. She told him plainly. She did not embellish, and did not shrink, and somewhere in the plainness of it he found himself, against all his intentions, inclined to linger. He lingered, and lingering, his eye fell upon a squat, mud-colored volume set apart on the work-table, its boards swollen and cracked along the spine, the marbled end paper inside long since given over to damp and mold. "That one may as well go to the fire," he said, in the idle way of a man passing sentence on a thing he had not troubled to examine. "There is nothing to be salvaged in it. I recall it from my father's time. A rent record, nothing more. Not worth the hours it would cost you." She did not answer at once. She lifted the volume instead, turning it in the gray window light, and ran her thumb along the ridge where the boards met the spine, feeling for the give of the stitching beneath. "Your Grace is mistaken," she said. He looked at her then, with the particular stillness of a man unused to hearing that phrase, addressed to himself, in that house, by anyone beneath the rank of his own mother. "I beg your pardon." "The binding is ruined, it is true," she said, "but the gathering beneath it is whole. I have seen water do worse to books that came out readable to the last page, and I have seen a handsome cover hide nothing at all worth the keeping. The worth of a thing is not always where it shows itself first." She set it down again, gently, as though it were a sleeping animal she did not wish to wake. "I should not throw it on the fire until I have opened it properly." He was quiet a moment. It was not, she would learn later, a silence he gave often. Those about him were accustomed to filling it themselves, agreeing before he had finished the thought. So practiced was the household in anticipating him. She did not fill it. She only waited, with the same composure she had carried into the hall 3 mornings before, as though she had said nothing more remarkable than the hour. "You are very certain," he said at last, and there was something in his voice that was not quite displeasure, though it wore displeasure's shape from long habit. "I have been wrong before, Your Grace," she said, "but not often about paper." A short breath left him, not quite a laugh, not quite its opposite, and he turned the volume over once in his own hands, before setting it down exactly where she had left it, as if some order had been restored to the room that he had not noticed disturbed. "See that it is open, then," he said, "before it is condemned." "I intend to," she said, and took it up again as though the matter had never been otherwise settled, and he found, walking back through the corridor a moment later, that he could not entirely account for the fact that he had come to check an expense and left having been corrected, and that he did not, on reflection, much mind it. She kept the volume until the light thinned toward evening, and it was then, working the blade beneath a board that had swollen and split along its old glue, that her fingers caught on something wrong. Not damage, intention. A second layer of binder's board, cut precisely to the width of the first, pasted flush against it so that only a careful hand, a hand that had spent years learning how leather and paste and pressure ought to feel when they were honest, would notice the seam at all. She set the knife down. She did not cut further that night, though it cost her something to wait. A false cover was not a thing to be opened by lamplight and haste, whatever lay beneath it. She wrapped the volume in its cloth as though it were sleeping, and she sat a long while with her hands folded, turning over not the ledger, but a smaller, older puzzle that had nagged at her since the courier had come to the bindery door those days before, asking, in the mild and roundabout way of a man performing an errand he did not fully understand, whether she had ever repaired estate accounts, and whether her stitches held under weight, and whether, this last almost carelessly, she was accustomed to working alone, without her uncle's oversight. She had thought it curiosity then, or gossip traveling ahead of her, the town's usual appetite for turning a woman's business into everyone's. She understood it differently now, sitting in the hush of the workroom with the false cover cool beneath her palm. No steward sends a man 3 miles to ask after glue and thread unless someone above him wishes to know, without asking directly, whether the hands about to be trusted with 3 centuries of paper can be trusted at all. The Duke had not summoned her blind. He had tested her first, quietly, at a distance, the way a man tests ice before he permits his household to walk upon it, and only when the ice held had the carriage come. It ought to have offended her, perhaps. She found instead that it steadied her, the way it always steadied her, to learn that a thing had been done with care rather than carelessness, even a care exercised at her expense. He was not a man who acted first and inquired after. He inquired, and weighed, and only then acted, and had said as much of himself, in his own fashion, that very afternoon, standing over a ledger he had not wanted opened. She thought of his hand turning the volume once before setting it down. She thought of the false cover waiting beneath her palm, patient as a held breath, and of what it might mean that someone had troubled to hide a second set of pages inside an estate account, rather than simply losing them, the way papers were so often, conveniently, lost. Tomorrow, she decided, she would open it properly tomorrow, by daylight, with witnesses if the household would allow it. Whatever slept inside that false cover, she did not think it would improve with keeping. The resolve did not survive the hour. She told herself she would wait for daylight, for witnesses, for the ordinary courage that comes easier when the sun is up and other people are moving about the house. And then she found herself, near midnight, seated at the small work table in the chamber they had given her, the false cover open beneath a single candle, her needle already parting the first stitch before she had properly decided to begin. The thread was old, waxed, the kind bookbinders used 40 years past and rarely since. It came away reluctantly, thread by thread, the board beneath it stiff with age and something else, a second layer of paper, pressed flat and sewn in along the spine so cleverly that a careless hand would have taken it for mere reinforcement. She worked with the small knife her father had given her, the one with the bone handle worn smooth by his thumb before it had ever touched hers, and she did not hurry, because hurrying was how good work was ruined and secrets along with it. When the last stitch gave, the pages came free almost gently, as though relieved to be found. The hand was not the steward's. She knew the steward's hand by now, cramped, businesslike, fond of abbreviation. This was looser, older, the ink browned to the color of strong tea, the letters formed with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his life doubted that his word would be honored. She read it once quickly, disbelieving, and then again slowly, tracing each line with the tip of her finger, as though touch might confirm what her eyes reported. It was a forgiveness, plainly written, dated, witnessed, a debt owed by a tenant family, struck through and declared paid in full by the hand of the late Duke himself, 11 years before this night, in consideration, the page said, of losses the family had suffered that winter, which needed no further recounting. Below it, a second note in the same hand, briefer, that the matter was closed and was not to be raised again with the family in question, on his authority as head of the house. She sat back, the candle guttered and steadied. Outside, the wind had dropped to nothing, and the silence of the sleeping house pressed in around her, the kind of silence that seemed, absurdly, to be listening. If the debt had been forgiven 11 years past, and forgiven in writing, in the old Duke's own hand, then whatever entries she had glimpsed earlier that day in the current account books, the quarterly sums, the tenant's name she had not thought to question, were not records of a debt still owed. They were records of one being collected anyway. She looked at the 2 pages a long while before she trusted herself to move, and when she finally rose to hide them safely away until morning, her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. She did not sleep so much as wait for the sky to change color, and when the first gray showed at the shutter's edge, she rose, dressed by feel, and carried the candle back to the shelf where the current account books lay stacked beside the ledgers she had already mended. These were not the old man's work. The hand was different, smaller, more hurried, prone to blotting at the ends of lines, as though the writer begrudged the ink its drying time. She had noticed the hand before without troubling herself over it. Now she opened the most recent volume with a care that felt almost like trespass. She found the name within a quarter hour. It sat in a column headed only with a date, no explanation offered, as entries of long habit rarely offer explanation to those who keep them. A sum, modest but not trifling, the kind a widow would feel the absence of at the bottom of a hard month, recorded against the family's name each quarter, going back through volume after volume, the same hand, the same modest sum, the ink darker in some years than others, as though the pen itself had changed with the seasons, but the entry never had. She turned back further, to the year that matched the date on the forgiven page upstairs, and found the entries continuing straight through it, unbroken, as though no forgiveness had ever been written down at all. 11 years of quarters. 44 payments, by her count, though she made herself count twice before she trusted the number. She sat very still with the book open on her knees. It was possible, she told herself, that the debt recorded here was some later obligation, unrelated to the one forgiven, a fresh loan, a fresh need. She turned each page slowly, looking for any note of a new arrangement, any sum advanced, any signature of consent from the family itself. There was none. Only the same quiet, patient collecting, quarter upon quarter, entered by a hand that was not the old Duke's, and had never once, in 11 years, referred back to the page that closed the matter. She thought of the widow's name, written twice now, in 2 different hands, once in forgiveness, once in demand, and of how easily the second could stand in a stranger's eye for simple diligence. A steward, doing no more than his duty by the estate's accounts. She closed the book without deciding anything, because there was nothing yet to decide, only something to know, and knowing it changed the shape of the morning ahead of her. The house was stirring now, a door somewhere, a scrape of boots on stone, and she rose and pressed the wrinkles from her skirt with hands that had gone steady again, though her mind had not, and went down to find whoever might tell her, without her asking outright, who had kept these books for the family these 11 years past. She found the housekeeper first, in the still room, counting jars of preserve, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who trusted numbers more than people. A careful question about the account books, who had kept them, how long, brought an answer given without suspicion, the way one hands over a fact too dull to guard. 11 years, since shortly after the old Duke's passing. The same hand the whole time, steady, reliable. The estate had never had cause to look twice at him. She thanked her, and went out into the corridor, and stood a moment with her back against the cold stone, because the word, reliable, had landed on her like a stone dropped from a height. To speak was simple in the saying, and monstrous in the doing. She turned it over, as she might turn a damaged spine, looking for where it would split. A steward of 11 years' standing, trusted with the whole running of the house, a man the Duke had likely never had reason to doubt in all that time, and she, a bookbinder's daughter summoned for her hands and not her judgment, proposing to tell him his own household kept a thief inside it. She could see how it would look to anyone who wished to see it unkindly. An upstart girl making herself indispensable by manufacturing a scandal. Her uncle's voice came to her unbidden, saying she would embarrass herself before she was through, and she hated that he should be right about anything. And yet, she thought of the widow's name in the old Duke's hand, forgiven and finished, and of the same name entered again and again by a man who knew perfectly well what the first page said, because he was the one who had filed it away where no one would think to look. There was no reading of that which came out as innocence. Diligence did not require silence about 11 years of debt already closed. She could say nothing, and go on binding pages, and let the ledgers pass into some cabinet in the trustee's hands, unread as they had been meant to be. It would cost her nothing. It would cost a widow whatever remained of what had been taken from her, quarter upon quarter, and it would cost the Duke the plain truth of the house he believed himself to understand. She found she could not weigh those two costs on the same scale at all. By the time she reached the library door again, her decision had settled into her the way a good binding settles into its boards, not with drama, but with the quiet finality of something correctly done. She would not go to the steward, she would not go to the housekeeper, nor drop hints in corridors for others to carry. She would go to the one person whose name was written, forgiving, at the top of the very first page. She smoothed her sleeves, gathered the ledger and its false cover beneath her arm, and went to find the Duke before the morning could talk her out of it. He was in the small study off the gallery, not the library itself, standing at a window with his back to the door, a cup of tea cooling untouched on the sill beside him. He did not turn at the sound of her step. He had grown accustomed, in a fortnight, to knowing it from the housekeeper's heavier tread. "You've found something," he said, before she had spoken a word. "I have." He turned then. Whatever he saw in her face made him set down the letter he had been holding. She did not wait for him to ask twice. She crossed the room, laid the ledger open on the desk between them, and turned back the false cover with the flat of her hand, the way she might have shown a client a flaw in a binding, plainly, without softening, without apology for the bringing of bad news. "Your father's hand," she said, on the first page. "He forgave the Whitfield debt 11 years ago. Struck it through himself, and wrote why." He bent over the page. She watched him read it twice, his mouth going still in the particular way of a man arranging his face before it could betray him. "And this," she said, drawing out the current account book, opening it to the marked quarter, "is not your father's hand." He read the second entry more slowly than the first. The room held only the sound of rain returning against the glass, and the small tick of the mantel clock, and her own breathing, which she kept even by will alone. "Quarterly," she said, when he did not speak. "For years, recorded as owed and collected, from a widow who has been paying twice over for a debt that no longer existed the day your father put down his pen. You are certain. I am certain of what is written. I make no claim beyond that. He looked up at her then, and there was nothing cold in it, only the particular exposure of a man discovering that the ground beneath a house he thought he knew had been quietly hollowed out for years by someone he trusted to walk it for him. You might have said nothing, he said. It was not quite a question. I might have. Why didn't you? She did not answer at once. She thought of the widow she had never met, of quarters upon quarters, folding into years, of a man's forgiveness, written once in good faith, and then unwritten in secret by someone else's hand. Because it was written down, she said finally. Someone meant it to be found. He looked at the page a long moment, then closed the ledger himself, carefully, as though it might yet be undone by rough handling. Send for Marsh, he said quietly, tonight. Marsh came within the hour, summoned from his cottage, where a lamp had still been burning, as though he too had been waiting for some reckoning to find him in his sleep. He entered the study with his coat buttoned wrong at the collar, and he saw the ledger open on the desk before he saw the man behind it, and something in his face went the color of old tallow. He did not ask what it was. That, more than anything, told its own story. Sit, the Duke said. He did not sit. He stood with his hands folded before him in the manner of a man accustomed to being trusted, and for a long moment nothing was said at all, the fire ticking in the grate, the rain still faint against the glass as it had been all that week, as it had been the night the roof gave way and started this whole unraveling. 11 years, the Duke said at last. You knew what my father wrote. You watched him write it. I did. His voice did not break, but it thinned, like thread pulled too far. I did not think. He stopped, began again. I did not think it would be found. That is not an answer to why. The steward's jaw worked once. He looked, briefly, toward the window, as though the dark fields beyond might offer him some better account of himself than he could give on his own. My own debts, your grace. Not large ones, small ones, that grew. A daughter to place well, a wife who was ill for 2 winters running, and physicians who do not treat a man's excuses as payment. He drew a breath. I told myself it was owed regardless of the paper, that your father's kindness had been misplaced, that I was only correcting what should never have been forgiven in the first place. That was not yours to correct. No, the word came out low, stripped of all its former polish. It was not. There was no shouting. There was, Eliza thought, watching from near the door where she had been asked to remain as witness to the ledger's provenance, something almost worse than shouting, a quiet so total that the man's shame filled it entirely on its own, without anyone needing to raise a voice to make it larger. You will repay what was taken, the Duke said, in full, from your own accounts, and you will do it before Michaelmas. You will not be dismissed tonight. You will not be dismissed publicly, but you will not touch another ledger in this house, unwitnessed again. Marsh's throat moved. Your grace is more generous than I would have been. My father was generous, the Duke said. I am only trying to finish what he started, before someone else erased it. He did not look at Eliza when he said it, but she understood, in the particular stillness of the room, that the sentence had been meant, in some part, for her to hear. The steward left the room as a man leaves a church he no longer believes in, quietly, with his hat held wrong, as though he had forgotten which hand it belonged in. No one spoke until his footsteps had faded past the second landing. Then the housekeeper, who had stood the whole time with her hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone white, let out a breath that seemed to have been held since the previous winter. The widow and her 2 sons were sent for within the week. She came in a borrowed shawl, expecting, by the set of her shoulders, some fresh misfortune, the kind her family had grown practiced at absorbing without complaint. When the sum was placed before her, repaid in full with the quarter's interest besides, she did not weep, though her hands shook enough that the coins slid twice from the table's edge before she managed to gather them. She thanked the Duke with a formality that did not suit her, as though grief and gratitude had worn the same groove in her for so long she no longer knew which words belonged to which. The tenants of the lower farms heard of it by Sunday. The story traveled the way such stories do in small places, reshaped at each hearth, growing more merciful or more scandalous, depending on who told it. But the essential bone of it held. The old debt was dead, and it had died because a bookbinder's daughter had found what a steward had buried. It was not announced that Eliza had found it, but it was not hidden either, and in a household run on decades of careful silences, the absence of concealment was its own kind of proclamation. Within a fortnight, she was asked her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with vellum or thread, whether the East tenancy roofs should be reshingled before winter, whether the school endowment her father's old friend the vicar had proposed years ago ought finally to be funded. She answered plainly, the way she always had, without dressing her thoughts in more authority than they deserved, and the Duke listened as though this were the most natural arrangement in the world, rather than the precise inversion of everything Ashcombe Hall had run on for 3 generations. The butler noticed first, because butlers notice everything before anyone admits to noticing it themselves. He began, without comment, to set a second chair nearer the desk in the estate office, angled just enough to suggest permanence rather than errand. The housekeeper noticed next and said nothing at all, which from her was its own form of astonishment. Eliza noticed only that she had stopped feeling like a guest in the house, and had not yet decided whether that frightened her more than it should. It happened on a Tuesday, in the narrow passage between the still room and the servants' stair, where the housekeeper had cornered the butler with a tray of mended linen, and no real reason to be carrying it there. He asked her about the drainage on the lower meadow, she said, as though reporting a death. The butler did not look up from the ledger of household accounts he was reconciling by candlelight, though his pen paused, briefly, above the column. He asked the steward about drainage for 11 years, he said. It is not so remarkable a subject. He did not ask the steward whether he agreed. The water table had shifted since the flood. He asked her whether she thought it had. The housekeeper set down the tray with more care than it required, the linen barely stirring. He has not asked anyone what they think of anything since her ladyship died. Not the trustees, not the vicar, not I, though I have offered my opinion on the state of the West Wing chimneys for 6 winters running, unasked and unwelcomed. The butler set his pen down at last. Outside, the rain had settled into the patient, ordinary sort that no longer announced itself, only continued, the way certain habits of a house continue once they have worn a groove deep enough. You make it sound as though he has taken up a new vice, he said. I make it sound as though he has taken up an old one and put it down for 7 years and picked it back up without appearing to notice he had done so. She folded her arms, not unkindly. There is a difference between a man consulting his household and a man consulting a person. He has begun doing the second. He does not know it yet. That is generally how it begins. The butler considered this with the same unhurried attention he gave to silver that wanted polishing, turning it, weighing where the tarnish sat. You are not suggesting. I am suggesting nothing, she said, in the tone of a woman suggesting a great deal. I am only telling you what I have seen in this house for 24 years, and what I have not seen in the last 7, and what I have seen again in the last fortnight. Draw your own conclusions. You are paid enough to be discreet about them. She took up the tray again and continued down the passage, her footsteps unhurried, entirely unremarkable, the footsteps of a woman who had said exactly as much as she intended and not one word further. The butler sat alone with the ledger a while longer, the candle guttering low, and found that he had stopped adding figures altogether. He thought of the second chair he had set nearer the desk, angled just so, and of how he had told himself it signified nothing beyond convenience. He closed the ledger without finishing the column, which was not like him at all, and went to see that the fires were banked for the night. His own small, private way of pretending he had not just understood something he had no intention of saying aloud to anyone, least of all to the 2 people it concerned. The library at 10:30 kept its own hours, indifferent to the household settling into sleep around it. 2 candles burned near the long table, their light pooling over ink and paper, and the careful stitching of a spine not yet finished. The tea between them had gone cold an hour before, and neither had remarked on it, as though to mention the tea would be to admit how long they had sat there, and how little either wished to be the one to end it. He turned a page of the account book with more care than the paper required. She watched his hand rather than the page, then caught herself watching, and returned her attention to the folio spread before her, a repaired leaf, the tear mended so finely that only the faintest seam remained, like a scar healed clean. "You have made it whole again," he said. "I have made it whole," she said. "Whole is a different matter. The tear is still there, underneath. One only learns not to see it." He considered this longer than the remark seemed to warrant. Outside, the wind moved once against the windows and was still. Somewhere below, a door closed with the particular softness of a servant who did not wish to be heard closing it. "Is that true of ledgers as well?" he asked, "or only of pages?" "I think it is true of most things a person is asked to mend," she said, and did not look up from the leaf. He set down his pen. For a moment he only watched her work, the small, deliberate motions of thread and needle, the way she held the page as though it might yet be hurt further if handled carelessly. He had watched her work before, over ink stains, over the false cover, over the widow's account, but never, he realized, simply for the watching. The thought arrived without alarm, and settled somewhere he did not examine. "You need not stay so late," he said, though he made no move toward the door himself. "Nor need you," she said. Neither rose. The candles burned a little lower. She finished the stitch, tied it, and held the page up to the light, the seam nearly invisible now, the tear folded into its own quiet history. He reached for it before she offered it, and their hands did not quite touch, and the near touching seemed, to both of them, to require rather more silence afterward than it should have. The butler, passing the library door on his final round, saw the light beneath it, considered knocking, and did not. Word travels faster than carriages, and it travels best on the tongues of those with least to occupy them. It began, as such things do, in the small transactions of a market town, a grocer's boy who had a cousin in service at the hall, a laundress who had heard from the housekeeper's niece, a curate who mentioned, after service, that the bookbinder's daughter had been seen twice now at the Duke's own table, not below the salt, but beside it. By the second week the story had grown legs of its own, that she kept the estate's books now, that she had uncovered some scandal involving the steward, that the Duke consulted her on matters no housekeeper or agent would presume to touch. Some of this was true, most of it was embroidered past recognition, as gossip in a fog-bound town always is, each teller adding a thread until the whole cloth bore little resemblance to the plain weave it had started from. The draper heard it first, from a customer buying black crepe for a morning bonnet, who mentioned it as one mentions weather, idly, expecting no consequence. He heard it again from his own wife, who had heard it from the baker, who swore it came direct from the hall itself. By the third telling, his face had gone the color of old wax. He did not, at first, credit it. His niece, who mended spines for pennies, seated at a duke's table. The notion offended him on principles he could not entirely name, though pride and profit were chief among them. He had said, at his own table, before witnesses, that no duke would ever look twice at a bookbinder. To have that prediction unmade in the hearing of the whole market town was not merely an embarrassment to her, it was an embarrassment to him, to the name he had lent her, however grudgingly, and to the authority he had always assumed came with lending it. He sat that evening with his ledger open before him, though he added no figures. He thought of the summons that had come at dawn, the carriage he had said would never arrive, arriving. He thought of how a man's word, once proven wrong in public, became a thing other men remembered longer than they remembered the man himself. By the third day he had made his decision. He would go to Ashcombe Hall himself, and bring her home, and put an end to whatever foolishness had taken root there, before the whole town learned to laugh at him instead of with him. He hired the fastest trap the livery stable kept, and set out before the fog had properly lifted, wearing his good coat, the one he kept for weddings and funerals, and occasions when appearances required defending. The road to Ashcombe Hall was longer than he had allowed for, and by the time the gatehouse came into view, his temper had curdled into something harder than the grievance he had started with. He did not wait to be announced. He came up the drive on foot from where the trap had stopped, past the startled boy who held the horse, past a gardener who straightened at the sight of him, and then did not move to stop him, some old instinct in a draper's stride, convincing lesser men he had business there. He reached the front steps as the great door opened, not for him, but because the housekeeper had heard wheels on gravel and come to see whose they were. He did not remove his hat. "I've come for my niece," he said, in the voice he used with debtors, pitched to Carrie. "Eliza Marrow. Tell her uncle is here, and there'll be no more of this play acting at a lady's position. She belongs at home, mending what she's paid to mend, before her name becomes a byword in every parlor from here to Thornfield." The housekeeper did not step aside. She had the particular stillness of a woman who had served a house long enough to know which storms passed quickly and which required standing firm against. "Miss Marrow is engaged with His Grace at present," she said. "I could not interrupt them for less than a fire." "Then interrupt them for a fire," he said. "Tell them the family's good name is burning." A footman had appeared behind the housekeeper by then, and a second figure beyond him, Eliza herself, drawn by the raised voice, standing in the hall's shadow with a ledger still in her hand, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, as though she had come straight from a workbench, and not from any drawing room. She looked, he thought, entirely unlike a girl caught out. She looked like someone interrupted in the middle of work she meant to finish. "Uncle," she said, without stepping forward, "you've had a long ride for nothing." "I've had a long ride," he said, "to bring you to your senses before this house makes a fool of you, and a scandal of us both." Behind her, unhurried, the Duke came into the hall. He came the way he always entered a room, without announcement, as if the room ought to have expected him, and the uncle, seeing the fine dark coat and the composed face, made the mistake so many had made before him. He read quiet for weakness. "Your Grace," he said, with a bow too deep to be sincere, "I'll not waste your time. My niece has been useful to you, I'm told, mending your books, and I'm glad of it. But a bindery girl, playing at consequence, in a duke's hall, does neither of you credit. She belongs in a shop with glue on her fingers, not standing about in libraries giving her opinion where it isn't wanted." Unquote. The words fell into a silence that had weight, the way a dropped plate has weight before it shatters. The housekeeper's mouth tightened. The footman looked at the floor. Somewhere behind them a door had opened. The butler, drawn by the same instinct that draws every servant in a house to the sound of a guest forgetting himself, and stood watching with the flat, careful attention of a man memorizing a scene he expected to be asked about later. "No Duke," the uncle went on, warming to an old rhythm, the same one he had used at his own table 3 nights before her summons, "will ever look twice at a bookbinder. I said as much to her face, and I'll say it now to yours. You've indulged her, sir, and it does you no honor." He had meant it, perhaps, as flattery folded around an insult. A man of rank surely could not truly value such a girl, and to suggest otherwise was to suggest folly on the Duke's part, not merit on hers. It was the sort of remark that had always worked in his own parlor, where no one dared correct him. It did not work here. The Duke did not raise his voice, did not so much as change the angle of his shoulders. He simply looked at the man the way one looks at a ledger entry that does not balance, with a patience that has already decided the matter and is only waiting for the other party to notice. "You mistake the house you're standing in," he said. Eliza did not move. She had gone very still, the ledger held against her like something she might need for balance rather than for reading, and it was the housekeeper, watching her, who understood first that the girl was not afraid of what came next, only waiting, the way she always waited, to see whether the world would prove itself worth her patience one more time. Her uncle's mouth opened, the practiced beginning of some further correction, some reminder of blood and obligation that had always been enough to close a conversation in his own house. He got no further than the first syllable. "You called her a bookbinder's daughter," the Duke said, as though the words were an accusation. "In this house they are a description of the person who saved 3 centuries of my family's records from a trustee's auction block, and who found, in the space of a fortnight, a theft my own steward concealed for years. I have had men of considerable rank in my employ who could not manage either task." He paused, and the pause was worse than anything that might have filled it. "No duke will ever look twice at a bookbinder," you told her, "at your own table, in front of people who should have defended her, and did not. I find I have looked at her rather more than twice. I intend to go on doing so." "You will not." The words landed the way a dropped ledger lands, flat, final, the sound of something closing rather than breaking. The uncle's face went through several arrangements before settling on none of them convincingly. He looked to the housekeeper, who did not meet his eyes. He looked to the butler, whose expression had arranged itself into the particular blankness servants keep in reserve for moments they intend to remember precisely and describe later, to someone, in detail. "You forget yourself," the uncle managed, though the sentence had no weight left to carry. "I have not," the Duke said. "I have simply stopped forgetting her." He turned, not sharply, not with any theater in it, and addressed the butler instead, as though the uncle had already left the room. "See that the gentleman's carriage is brought round. He will not be staying." There was no shout, no gesture toward the door, nothing a witness could later embellish into drama. That was, Eliza thought, the particular cruelty and mercy of rank, that a man could be dismissed from a house in the same tone he might use to order tea, and the dismissal would be no less absolute for its quiet. Her uncle's eyes found her at last, and for one unguarded moment, something crossed his face that was almost, plain astonishment, as though he had walked into a shop, expecting to buy back a debt, and been told the currency no longer existed. Then the butler was at his elbow, murmuring something courteous and immovable, and the moment closed. The fog had not lifted since morning, only thinned in places where the sun tried and failed to burn through, and it was into this half-light that the uncle stepped when the doors opened for him. The same doors, Eliza thought, that had once seemed to promise nothing but a single day's errand, a summons to be answered and returned from before supper. He did not look back at the house. He looked instead at the street, at the wet cobbles holding the gray sky in broken pieces, as though the town itself owed him some explanation for what had just occurred inside. His carriage, hired, modest, its paint gone dull at the corners, waited exactly where he had left it, and beside it, unbidden, stood the ducal carriage that had first come for her at dawn weeks before. She saw him take its measure, the polish on the door, the crest she now recognized without needing to be told what it meant, the horses standing with the particular patience of animals, well fed and well kept. He had sworn, at a dinner table not so many months past, over cold mutton and a decanter he refused to pass, that no such carriage would ever come for her. He had said it as a kindness to himself, she understood now, not a prophecy, but a wall he built, because he could not imagine climbing it. She came out a few minutes after him, and there was no triumph in her step, only the ordinary economy of a woman with somewhere to be. She did not look at him for long. She did not need to, but she permitted herself, before she took the hand offered to help her up, one glance in his direction, not cruel, not even entirely without pity, the kind of glance one gives a door that has finally, after long resistance, been found to open the wrong way. He said nothing. There was nothing left in him shaped like a sentence. The carriage door closed with the soft, final sound such doors always made, a sound she had once found frightening in its finality, and now found only orderly, like the closing of a ledger correctly balanced. The wheels took the wet stones without hurry. Through the small window she watched him grow smaller, standing exactly where he had stood, his hired carriage forgotten behind him, until the fog took the shape of him entirely and left only the shape of the street, the same street, she thought, though nothing in it, nor in her, remained quite the same as when she had first walked its length as no one in particular. Months settled the way sediment settles in still water, not all at once, but by a slow accumulation no single day accounted for. The bindery in Thornfield Market kept its hours. The bell above the door still rang thin and cracked, the smell of hide glue and beeswax still hung in the back room, and she still bent over spines by candlelight when the afternoon light failed her, exactly as she had before any carriage had come for her at dawn. She had not given up the shop. She had only enlarged what it meant to keep it. Letters arrived on the 1st and the 15th, without fail, in a hand grown less formal with each month, beginning, Miss Marrow. Becoming simply a date and an account of small things, a tenant's roof mended, a hedge dispute settled without lawyers, a question about the proper oil for calf leather that could easily have been asked of anyone, and was asked, each time, of her. She answered in the same measured hand her father had taught her, ink never blotted, margins never wasted. Neither letter, in all those months, used the word that both were careful to leave unwritten. The housekeeper at Ashcombe Hall, questioned once by a visiting cousin as to whether the Duke intended anything by such correspondence, said only that his lordship kept his own counsel, and had done so all his life, and that some men's regard was better read in what they preserved than in what they declared. What he preserved was a single page. It lived in the drawer of his writing desk, not the library. A single leaf of vellum from the false-covered ledger, its corner misbound where her needle had caught the grain wrong in haste. 3 centuries of family record steadied under her hand, on the night she had first shown him what honesty cost and what it repaid. He had meant to have it properly rebound. He never sent it. On evenings when the estate's ledgers balanced and the house was quiet, he would take it out, study the small imperfect stitch at its edge, and return it, unmended, to its place. It was not a ring. It was not a promise spoken aloud in any hall. It was a flawed page, kept on purpose, by a man who had learned, from a bookbinder's daughter, in a season of flood and false accounts, that the truest things were rarely perfect, only carefully, deliberately, kept.